I'm Rivka Kahan, and we'll be using al-HaTorah resources to explore the enigmatic and perplexing story of the Benei HaElohim and Benot HaAdam, which is found toward the end of Parshat Breshit. Let's begin by looking together at the psukim that tell us the story of the Benei HaElohim and Benot HaAdam, which are found at the beginning of Breshit Perek Vav. The Torah tells us, "Vayihi ki hechel ha'adam larov al pnei ha'adama uvanot yuldu lahem," that it was when man began to multiply on the earth and to have daughters. Vayiru Benei HaElohim et Benot HaAdam ki tovot hena, vayikhu lahem nashim mikol asher bacharu. And the Benei HaElohim saw the Benot HaAdam, the daughters of man, that they were good, and they took for themselves wives from everyone that they chose. Vayomer Hashem lo yadon ruchi ba'adam le'olam b'shegam hu basar v'hayu yamav 120 shana. We're not going to translate this pasuk precisely. We'll see that there are a number of interpretations about how to understand it among Mefarshim. But in some sense in this pasuk, Hashem seems to be reflecting on the imperfection of man, and as a result of that imperfection, setting a time limit on man's existence of 120 years. And then in the next pasuk, in pasuk Daled, the Torah tells us that there were Nephilim, giants, on the earth at that time, during the period of the Benei HaElohim and Benot HaAdam. So we see that just from a cursory reading of these psukim, there are a number of questions that come up, both linguistically and conceptually. First of all, who were these Benei HaElohim? And were they actually divine or were they human? Second, what was the nature of the relationships between the Benei HaElohim and Benot HaAdam? And was there something immoral about those relationships that led to Hashem's response in Pasuk Gimel? Third is, what is the meaning of Hashem's response in Pasuk Gimel, of his statement that Lo yadon ruchi ba'adam le'olam b'shegam hu basar, and also of the time limit of 120 years. And finally, we're going to consider, how does this narrative fit into the surrounding story that's told at the beginning of Sefer Breshit about the decline of man that culminates in the story of the flood in Parshat Noach. So let's begin our exploration by considering the identity of the Benei HaElohim by looking at the meaning of the word Elohim in Tanakh and also at the meaning of that phrase, Benei HaElohim. So let's go back to Pasuk Bet and click on the word Elohim to see in the concordancia what that word means throughout Tanakh. And we'll see that in the vast majority of cases, the word Elohim refers to Hashem. But there are some important exceptions. So for example, if you look at the pasuk that is listed as the 253rd example that comes up, you'll see that in Shmot Perek Daled, Moshe is referred to as Aaron's Elohim, in other words, as a human leader who gives Aaron guidance. And the same meaning comes up in pasuk number 263 here from Shmot Perek Zayin, where again, Moshe is referred to as an Elohim. If we go a little bit farther down, and we look at the pasuk that comes up in number 322, we will see that here in Shmot Perek Kaf Bet, that judges are referred to as Elohim. And the same usage comes up in the next set of psukim from Shmot Perek Kaf Bet and also elsewhere in Tanakh. So we see that the word Elohim can refer to human leadership, and specifically to judges throughout Tanakh, although it usually does refer to Hashem. Now let's go back to our psukim and highlight the phrase Benei HaElohim to see what that phrase as a whole generally means in Tanakh. So we'll see that the phrase does not come up a lot in Tanakh. It comes up in our Perek, of course, and it also comes up later in Sefer Iyov. And in Sefer Iyov, in the psukim that appear as sources 11 and 12, you'll see, Vayhi hayom v'yavu b'nei ha'elohim li'yatziv al Hashem v'yavu gam hasatan b'tocham. We'll see that in those psukim, Benei HaElohim does seem to refer to divine beings, to angels. So let's keep in mind both of those findings about the meaning of both the word and the phrase as we consider the interpretations of the Mefarshim of our story. Now let's go back to our psukim and consider the interpretation of Rashi. So Rashi on Pasuk Bet explains that he believes Benei HaElohim refers to Benei Hasarim v'Hashoftim. He believes that the Benei Elohim were children of the ruling classes, children of leaders and judges, who engaged in relationships with people who were not from the ruling classes that were characterized by force and by licentiousness. So in other words, Rashi is doing something very interesting with these psukim. He understands this to be a story about the corruption of leadership, the ways in which people from the ruling classes took advantage of those who were sociologically less advantaged, and is reflecting on the sense in which corruption of leadership is often a stage in the decline of a society, and in this case is part of the story of the decline of man in the beginning of Sefer Breshit. When it comes to Pasuk Gimel, to Hashem's response, Rashi understands Lo Yadon Ruchi Ba'Adam as Hashem's statement that he will not allow his spirit to continually struggle about what to do about man in light of his corruption, but rather he is going to set a 120-year time limit by which he'll decide what to do about mankind, whether to destroy man or whether to have mercy on him. And ultimately, of course, he decides to destroy man in the flood. So that's the interpretation of Rashi about our story, both about what it means on its own and also about how it fits into the larger story of the decline of man and the coming of the flood. Now let's go back to our Mikraot Gedolot and look at some other interpretations. Let's begin by looking at the interpretation of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, which is in many ways different from Rashi, although it has some commonalities. So Rav Hirsch reminds us that Beprakim HaKodmim Lamanu al Shtei Shoshalot, Benei Kain uVnei Shet, that in the prakim that led up to this story, we learned about two different genealogies, that of Benei Kain and that of Benei Shet. And in the view of Rav Hirsch, the Benei Kain, that family, is focused on power and industry and acquisition, whereas the family of Shet is one that's far more spiritually refined. And in Rav Hirsch's view, this story of the Benei HaElohim and Benot HaAdam is about the intermarrying of those two lines, of the Benot HaAdam representing the line of Kayin, that less refined line, and the Benei HaElohim referring to the line of Shet. So in the view of Rav Hirsch, what this story is about is not the corruption of leadership, but the sense in which mankind as a whole becomes more universally degraded and immoral by becoming influenced by those elements of mankind who are less spiritually refined. In terms of the understanding of Hashem's response in Pasuk Gimel, Rav Hirsch takes an opinion that in some ways is similar to Rashi's, but in some ways is different. So he understands the phrase Lo Yadon Ruchi Ba'Adam Le'olam B'Shagam Hu Basar differently from Rashi. In Rav Hirsch's view, Ruchi Ba'Adam is one phrase. What Hashem is saying here is that God's spirit, which is within man, will not continue to serve as man's judge and moral compass forever. Because of the decisions that man is making, he's moving away from the godly spirit that rests within him. And as a result of that growing immorality and corruption, Hashem sets a 120-year time limit, similar to what Rashi says, by which he will judge mankind as a whole and decide whether to destroy them or whether to have mercy on them. Some of the concerns that might come up about the approach of Rav Hirsch are that while there is certainly background to suggest that the word Elohim can refer to human leadership, we don't see any kind of precedent for the idea that these two words of Elohim and Adam can refer to two different lineages within man, two different family lines. And one might also object that the notion that a person is morally predestined for a certain path is based on his family lineage is somewhat problematic. But at the same time, Rav Hirsch does explain within both the context of the preceding prakim about the lineage of man and within the surrounding narrative of the decline of man, he explains the story in an interesting way to refer to the growing immorality and the growing uniformity of immorality within man. Now let's look at another interpretation which appears in the Midrash. Let's look at the Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer. The Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer takes an interesting view. We'll read one line of it. The Midrash says, Rabbi Omer, Ra'u hamalachim shanaflu mimakom kedushatan min hashamayim et benot Kayin. So this is a source that actually reads Benei HaElohim in the sense of referring to divine beings, to angels. And the Midrash here understands that the relationships described in these psukim are relationships between angels and men, and human beings, that were inappropriate, and that therefore represent another stage in the decline of man at the beginning of Sefer Breshit. And on the one hand, this is compelling because, as we saw, the phrase Benei HaElohim does otherwise in Tanakh refer to angels, to divine beings. On the other hand, it seems a little bit hard to understand because we don't have precedent in the Torah for the idea that divine beings and human beings can marry each other. And in general, that notion seems to have sort of pagan undertones and to be difficult to reconcile with the monotheistic theology of the Torah. Now let's look at one more approach, which is a very fascinating middle ground approach that combines some of the strengths of Rashi's interpretation of the Benei HaElohim and also the Midrash. Let's look at the Malbim together. The Malbim suggests to us that we read this story within the context of the ancient world. The Malbim begins by saying, Yadua b'korot ha'amim ha'kadmonim, shahayu ma'aminim shebenei Elohim choshkim et Benot HaAdam. That in the ancient world, people believed that there were angels who desired human women and who married them. So what the Malbim suggests is that the phrase Benei Elohim does refer to angels, but the beings described in these psukim were not actual angels. They were people who were believed by the people around them to be angels, mistakenly. And that they took advantage, these human beings who were mistakenly believed to be angels, took advantage of that power by forcing women to have relationships with them. So what's interesting about the Malbim is he takes the straightforward understanding of what the phrase Benei HaElohim means, but avoids the theological problems of asserting that they were actually angels who married human beings. And he also integrates the notion that Rashi suggests that this is really a story about corruption of leadership, because it's a story about these people who took advantage of what other people believed about them to engage in relationships with Benot HaAdam, with regular human women. When it comes to Hashem's response in Pasuk Gimel, the Malbim believes that the limit of 120 years is a limit on the individual human lifespan, not, as Rav Hirsch and Rashi suggested, a limit by which Hashem will judge mankind as a whole. And the Malbim suggests that Hashem is referring to the corruption within man, and therefore limiting his lifespan, both so that there will be a limit to how much evil the individual human being can perpetrate in his life, and also so that perhaps people will be inspired to do tshuva and to introspect because they're aware of their own mortality. So Malbim takes a different view of this 120 years in light of the way that he understands the story as a whole. We've seen a number of different interpretations to help us make sense both linguistically and conceptually of this perplexing and fascinating story toward the end of Parshat Breshit, and to understand the role that it plays in the surrounding narrative. And I think also by exploring this story in depth, we gain greater insight into the Torah's perspective, both on the decline of man at the start of human history, but also into the human frailties that reside within human nature for all eternity. To learn more about this narrative and about other topics within Tanakh, please visit al-hatorah.org. Thank you.